Moscow that Russia would basically just give
Peace lies in Moscow.
Napoleon, 8th September 1820.
Russia, 1812. Napoleon invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen. But for the French Emperor, the decisive blow remains frustratingly beyond reach. Russia's resilience is unlike anything he's ever encountered.
That's crazy.
And as winter closes in, his army begins the most infamous retreat in history.
It's kind of the same
Karma's a
intro
bitch.
he had in his last video.
History, like,
Part 3.
when you retreat, you just leave, right? Okay.
The 15th of September, 1812. 83 days after invading Russia, a week after his costly victory at Borodino, Napoleon entered Moscow. He expected to be greeted by dignitaries, formally offering the city's surrender.
Wow, really?
Instead, he discovered that 90% of Moscow's inhabitants had fled.
Yep.
A fire had started the previous night and was blamed on drunken soldiers. But over the next 48 hours, fires continued to break out across Moscow, until most of the city was ablaze. Count Fyodor Rostopchin, the city's governor, had ordered that Moscow be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands. And now fires were being started deliberately by Russian criminals freed from jail and acting on police orders. French soldiers rounded up and shot any they could catch. But the inferno was impossible to contain.
Just imagine what it would have been like in the streets of
In
that
4 days, 2/3 of Moscow was destroyed.
Oh my
With
gosh,
the fires finally
really?
under control, Napoleon's soldiers turned their attention to systematically looting the ruined city. While from his new quarters in the Kremlin, Napoleon sent a letter to Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg, inviting him to make peace and end the war.
It's like giving me anxiety hearing
He
that like
received
clock ticking with
no
all the
reply. Napoleon waited, confident that Alexander would eventually negotiate. But as the days passed, he grew increasingly uneasy.
Appreciate it.
Cossack raids were disrupting his vital communications with Paris, as well as the arrival of supplies. While the steady attrition of French forces and Russian reinforcements meant Napoleon was outnumbered for the first time in the campaign. Rumors also reached him that his reluctant allies, Prussia and Austria, were in secret talks with his enemies.
Uh-oh.
Napoleon had proposed that the army winter in Moscow, but that now looked too dangerous. Reluctantly, he accepted that the army would have to move back to Smolensk to find safe winter quarters. Napoleon knew how severe Russian winters could be, but continued to put off his departure, reassured by fine October weather, and hoping that at the last minute there might be a message from Alexander offering peace. It never came. On the 13th of October,
Basically,
the
his
first
allies
light
retreat
snow
against him.
fell.
Retreat against him.
5 days
You
later,
Russians are
Kutuzov
crazy,
launched
man.
a surprise attack on Murat's advance guard at Vinkova and defeated it. Napoleon, stung into action, gave the order for the army to leave Moscow the next day.
Of course, he didn't want to freeze. That was the moment my campaign begins.
That was the moment my campaign begins.
Oh, here
I thought
comes
Napoleon said that. I was like,
Alexander.
okay. Really egotistical.
100,000
Buckle up.
men of the Grande Armée left Moscow in a column 10 miles long, with an estimated 40,000 carriages and carts.
That's a big target.
There were women and children too. Army wives
Little
and
dogs.
the vivandières, the women who cooked for the soldiers, as well as some civilians. Every wagon and pack was stuffed with as much food and loot as possible. As he set off, Sergeant Bourgogne of the Imperial Guard made an inventory of his pack. It contained
I
several
spent
pounds
some
of
time in
sugar,
making an
rice,
examination of my
biscuit,
knapsack,
half a bottle of
and
liqueur,
had
a woman's
found several
Chinese
pounds of
silk
sugar,
dress
some rice,
embroidered in gold
some
and
biscuit,
silver,
half a bottle
several
of liquor,
gold and
a woman's
silver
Chinese silk
ornaments,
dress
amongst
embroidered in
these
gold,
of the
That's
cross
also
of high
something
silver,
that-
several
that-
gold and
Besides
silver
these,
ornaments.
I would say
uniform,
detrimental,
a woman's large
them.
riding
detrimental
cloak,
to the
2
Grand
silver
Cross
pictures
of Ivory,
because they had
engraved,
so
12
much
days I had my uniform,
high
a woman's
and it
large
would
riding
slow
cloak,
them
2 silver
down
pictures
so
in
much,
relief,
and a
12
lot of
inches
the
Russian princes
long,
set
and 8
when
set
an
8
order
high,
came
all
from
in the
Napoleon
finest
to
working
drop
shirt.
it,
Wore over
so
my
the
shirt
army
a
could
yellow
have
silk
rockets,
waistcoat,
Russian
which I had made myself
a
out
lot
of a
of them
woman's
left
skirt.
the regular
That's a
army
large
and
cake.
I wore over my shirt
Ermine
a yellow
and
silk
scattered
waistcoat,
around, and they
and
side
didn't
by
want
silver
to let the
cord.
loot
This
behind.
was full of various
So
things.
they
Over
got
that, a
caught
large
off by
crucifix in
either
gold and silver,
Cossacks
and a little
partisans
and a
Chinese
large
different
pouch
parts
hung
of
at my
groups in
side
Russia and
with
so on.
silver
firearms,
cord.
powder
This was
flasks,
full of various
60
things, amongst them
cartridges
a
in the
box.
box.
But just imagine carrying that. It slows your
Boss.
army.
This
Sounds too much
heavily
more
encumbered
ridiculous.
army did not yet realize it was in a race against time. The Russians were beginning to move against the flanks of Napoleon's 550-mile deep salient. That very day, Wittgenstein's army was driving back Marshal Saint-Cyr's outnumbered force at Polotsk and drawing Victor's 9th Corps west to support them. In the south, Admiral Chichagov's advance had Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps falling back to cover Warsaw.
See the
The corridor was
Oh,
closing.
they're trying to close in the end, yeah.
Look at
And
that.
then there was the weather. Though Napoleon was confident his army could reach winter quarters in Smolensk in 20 days, well before the more extreme temperatures were due to hit.
Wow.
so is he taking
Napoleon
that?
planned to withdraw via Kaluga, through unspoilt country where the army could forage for supplies.
Oh, that explains it.
But
Sorry.
Kutuzov sent General Dokhturov's 6th Corps to block the road at Maloyaroslavets. In fierce fighting, Italian troops of Eugene's 4th Corps drove the Russians out of the town. It was a hard-won victory, reminiscent of the fighting at Borodino.
Wow.
Kutuzov now stood between Napoleon and Kaluga.
Look at that. Okay.
Or
Napoleon
neighborhood.
now took the unusual step of conferring with his marshals. And after discussing various options, he decided that rather than seek another major battle, they would retreat the way they'd come, along the Smolensk road.
Wow.
Napoleon had hoped to avoid this route, as it meant marching back through country already stripped bare of supplies.
Okay, so it's a supply.
The day after the fighting at Maloyaroslavets,
Hey, it's my
Napoleon
birthday.
was nearly captured by a group of Cossacks, and saved only by General Rapp's charge at the head of his escort. After this close shave, Napoleon had a phial of poison made up, which he carried around his neck in case of capture.
Later on, he tried to kill himself with that
Crazy.
small capsule.
Those who were too weak to carry their weapons.
I think when he lost
Makes sense, so
at
he'd be
Waterloo,
tortured.
but I'm not sure.
Those who were too weak to carry the.
Don't mess with the Cossacks.
Gypsies, what the hell do they have to do with it?
Napoleon's army set off on its new course, shadowed at a respectful distance by Kutuzov's army to the south. They passed the old battlefield of Borodino, a grisly, unnerving sight, where crows pecked at half-buried corpses.
Oh
In
my
sight,
God.
relentless marching quickly began to tire out men and horses. A few days later, the temperature fell below freezing. The army's overworked, starving horses
-4.
died en masse.
-7 plus 32.
Discipline began to break down, as some drivers simply dumped the sick and wounded by the roadside to try to ensure their own survival. As the French column became increasingly strung out, General Miloradovich, commanding Kutuzov's advance guard, fell on Davout's rear guard outside Vyazma. For a few hours, Davout's 1st Corps was cut off, until Eugene and Ney came to his rescue. The battle ended with street fighting in Vyazma, as the French hastily evacuated the burning town. For the soldiers of the Grande Armée, so unaccustomed to retreats and routes, Vyazma was an alarming, demoralizing blow.
kind of what I
Fact that he's
said.
getting from behind.
And what people
Yeah,
often
was
forget
strewn
is
with the
that
dead
not
or
only the
suffering.
French suffered in the winter, the Russian military did the same,
On
and
the
the
4th of
civilians also.
November, it began to snow heavily. The next night, temperatures plummeted to minus 20 degrees
Oh
centigrade.
my god, minus 20.
Fahrenheit?
Few men or women had proper
can be
winter
completely wrong.
clothing
Fahrenheit.
or access to shelter.
Yes.
Many froze to death overnight. The next morning, wagons and guns were abandoned. Many soldiers sought to save themselves, ignoring officers, stealing horses and food, and leaving the column to scour the countryside for supplies. Many of these foragers were found by the Cossacks. Some cut down or lanced, others robbed of every possession and left to freeze. In a few cases, they were handed over to peasants, eager for retribution against the foreign invaders who had plundered all they owned.
Just a horrible situation.
Don't give
As the
them to
army
peasants.
struggled on towards Smolensk through blizzards, Napoleon ordered Eugene's 4th Corps to strike out for Vitebsk, where there were large French supply depots. But Vitebsk had already fallen to the Russians. 4th
just not
Corps
giving up,
was
is
too
he?
weak to fight its way through, and rejoined the army, minus its artillery and most of its baggage. A colonel who saw 4th Corps at this stage described men without shoes, almost without clothes, exhausted and famished, sitting on their packs, sleeping on their knees, and only rousing themselves out of this stupor to grill slices of horse meat or melt bits of ice.
Oh my god, I
Just
just
3 weeks after leaving
I
Moscow,
just saw
a
what that was
third of the
trying to
army
do
was
before
dead
before
or
sun.
captured. About half the rest formed a growing army of stragglers,
I-
men without units, prepared to fight only to survive. Napoleon
Great
reached
idea,
Smolensk on the 9th of November. The first troops into town ransacked the supply depots, leaving nothing for those who followed, including Ney's rearguard, which arrived 6 days later. Napoleon had hoped to make Smolensk his winter base, but the state of the army and lack of supplies meant the retreat had to continue. But the 5 days he spent there gave Kutuzov time to circle ahead and prepare an ambush. When the French retreat resumed, he struck 30 miles west of Smolensk at Krasny. In 3 days of desperate fighting through knee-deep snow, Napoleon used his Imperial Guard to hold open the road, as Eugene and Davout's corps fought their way through the ambush with heavy losses.
I mean, how are the French even still fighting at this
2
point?
regiments of the Young Guard were ordered to make a sacrificial counterattack to keep the
It
Russians
just
at
gets
bay.
worse. It just gets
Were
worse.
virtually annihilated.
I mean,
Kutuzov held back many of his troops and was blamed for not trying to destroy Napoleon's army when he had the chance. It's possible he was concerned at the number of raw conscripts in his own army, also suffering terribly in the freezing conditions.
So the Russians
what's
are
wrong with
just
this guy's
trying
eye?
to kind of stall
all the Cossacks
the
and
retreat
Russians in the world should not
and, you know,
be
like just
joining.
cut pieces from the French army.
What's
And
happening to
then
them?
maybe engage in a
Not
decisive
every
battle.
French corps broke through at Krasny. Marshal Ney and his 6,000-strong rearguard arrived on the 18th of November to find the road blocked by 60,000 Russian troops.
Wow.
And no sign of the promised support from Davout's 1st Corps.
60,000.
Ney's men hurled themselves against the Russian lines with desperate courage, but were mown down. Rejecting several invitations to surrender, Ney led the survivors in a daring night crossing of the Dnieper River, then across 45 miles of open country under constant attack from Platov's Cossacks to reach Orsha. By the time Ney rejoined the army, his rear guard was down to just 800 fighting men, leading a column of several thousand stragglers.
Just look at his face,
The
like,
army
oh my
regarded
God,
his
we
escape
really
as a
did it.
miracle.
We really did it.
And when Napoleon heard of it, he immediately dubbed Marshal Ney the bravest of the brave.
Huh.
Very serious.
Beginning.
Oh, now he
Beginning.
thinks
This is
it's
the
starting to
understatement
get
of this
very
video right
serious.
here.
I mean, it
Napoleon
is.
had escaped one trap, but now 3 Russian armies were closing in from different directions and outnumbered him nearly 3 to 1. From the east, Kutuzov's main army
There we go.
with 65,000 men. From the north, Wittgenstein with 30,000, steadily driving back Marshal Victor's 9th Corps. And from the south, Admiral Chichagov's army of Moldavia with 34,000, having detached General Ostensaken with 30,000 to prevent Schwarzenberg's Austrians and Reynier's Saxon Corps marching to Napoleon's aid.
Bruh.
Napoleon was heading for Minsk, a major French supply base with vast stores of the food, clothing, shoes and ammunition that his army so desperately needed. But on the 21st of November, disastrous news arrived. Minsk had fallen to Chichagov. He'd then marched on Borisov, driven out the Polish garrison,
That's crazy, man.
and
Russians
captured
do
its
that.
bridge over the Berezina River.
They've got Napoleon trapped here.
So what now?
By
How does he
rights,
get out?
the
I know
Berezina
Napoleon
ought
doesn't
to have
die
frozen
here,
solid
so
by now.
I'm wondering how he
So
gets out of
Napoleon
this.
could have crossed anywhere.
Look at that.
But a sudden thaw had turned the river into a torrent of ice and
Yeah, it's
freezing
hard to get
water.
through that. Yeah. It's not happening.
So is he going to try to escape via
Napoleon
Vilnius,
was at least
or-
joined by the hard-fighting Marshal Oudinot and his 2nd Corps, which hadn't suffered as badly as the main column on its retreat from Polotsk. Oudinot launched an immediate counterattack on Borisov and retook the town, but couldn't stop the Russians burning the bridge. With no other bridge for miles in either direction, it seemed Napoleon's exhausted army was finally doomed.
But they
But
get
there
out
was
somehow.
one sliver of hope.
Yeah.
Polish cavalry had found a ford across the river near the village of Studienka. Napoleon issued a flurry of orders. 2nd Corps was to fake preparations for a river crossing south of Borisov. Victor's 9th Corps, arriving from the north, was to form a rear guard east of Studienka to hold the Russians at bay, while engineers worked as quickly as possible to build pontoon bridges across the river and win Napoleon's army a fighting chance of escape.
The situation is unparalleled.
Read,
Napoleon
man, it's like
extricates
never
himself from
ending.
day. He must have the devil. Marshal Ney to General. So this is on the French.
On the afternoon of the 25th of November, General Eblay's Dutch engineers began building 2 300-foot pontoon bridges across the Berezina River.
300 feet. That's.
They worked day and night, sometimes
small
chest deep in freezing water, and completed both bridges in less than 24 hours.
War
Few
back
of
then
the
was
engineers
just-
survived the ordeal.
Yeah.
Chichagov
Yo,
had been
that's what I'm
totally
talking
fooled
about.
by the diversion south of Borisov and was moving his troops south to face it, allowing Napoleon's army to begin crossing its rickety bridges virtually unopposed. Oudinot's 2nd Corps led the way to secure a bridgehead, followed the next day by the remnants of the main army.
Russians not going to catch on.
Priority was given to formed troops, still able to fight. For the time being, the army's vast crowd of stragglers remained
Look
on
at
the far
that.
bank.
That is amazing. All of those people stuck over there.
By the time Chichagov realized his mistake and began moving north, Napoleon had troops in place to defend the crossing.
Yeah.
On the east bank, General Partonneux's 12th Division, 4,000 relatively fresh troops from Victor's 9th Corps, formed the rear guard. As Platov's Cossacks approached from the east, the vanguard of Kutuzov's main army, Artilleur tried to rejoin 9th Corps. But caught in a swirling blizzard, with visibility down to 50 meters, he marched straight into Wittgenstein's army.
Oh god, oh no.
His entire division was killed or captured.
4,000 men.
The next morning, Chichagov and Wittgenstein launched coordinated attacks on both sides of the river. There was desperate fighting on the west bank, where Marshal Oudinot was, yet again, seriously wounded, but his Swiss infantry held the line, until General Doumerc's cuirassiers, the army's last heavy cavalry, charged and routed the Russians. At great cost, Polish and German troops of Victor's rearguard held off the Russians until dark, then pulled back across the bridges.
Wow. Really many strategies
For
in this
2
video,
nights,
man. I'm sorry I
officers
don't
had been
talk
trying
much,
to get
it's
the
just
vast
interesting.
camp of stragglers to cross the bridges when they weren't being used. But with temperatures reaching minus 30 centigrade, they
You
preferred to
stuck, aren't
stay put, huddled around their fires.
Oh jeez, no! Not another horse being
At
cut
dawn
open.
on the 29th,
Oh
with
my
the
gosh.
army leaving and the Russians approaching, thousands of stragglers surged in panic towards the bridges.
Oh my god.
Dozens were crushed underfoot. Others fell or were pushed into the water, or tried to swim, which was certain death.
This is just one
When French
nightmare
engineers
after another.
burned the bridges
Just,
at
I mean,
9
it doesn't
a.m.,
stop.
thousands were cut off and left to the mercy
Oh
of
my
the
gosh,
advancing
this was just a
Cossacks.
huge disaster going
Some
into
became
Russia.
prisoners.
I mean, you think you would learn your lesson
Others
after
were
this
simply
and after
put
Hitler
out
and
of
World
their
War II.
misery.
Just don't try to invade Russia. It's
Oh
not going to
god.
work out very
It
well
would
for
be
you.
interesting
Although, I don't know,
if
like,
there
modern
is a
warfare is a
statistic
little
or
different.
something
What amounts you to have parachutes.
who the stragglers mostly were, like which
Since the retreat began 43 days earlier, the Grande Armée had marched nearly 500 miles, under constant attack, starved, exhausted,
Crazy.
and for the last 23 days, in lethal sub-zero temperatures, without proper clothing or shelter.
Congrats.
In that time, the fighting strength of the Grande Armée had been reduced from around 124,000 men to 20,000,
What?
with as many stragglers still following the army.
That is crazy.
As the retreat continued to Vilna, the weather turned even worse, the temperatures falling to minus 37 degrees centigrade.
Oh my god, 37.
The Russian armies at least now held back, leaving the
Just look
winter,
at this.
Cossacks, and Russian peasants to finish off the invaders. On the 5th of December, Napoleon left the army, traveling incognito across Europe at breakneck speed,
Oh,
and
no,
reaching
he
Paris
did
in
not.
just
Left the
13
army.
days.
No
The
way.
leader for you right there.
No
I'm assuming
way.
that's what's happening here.
Sure.
Naturally, English satirists capitalized on Napoleon seeming to abandon his defeated army,
Okay.
Of course they did.
and many soldiers did regard it as an act of betrayal.
But I can kind of understand him because
But his generals supported his decision to leave. There'd
Interesting.
already been one attempted coup against Napoleon in Paris,
Okay.
and there was much work to be done to rebuild the army
Yeah.
and reassure France's allies.
from a
On the
logical
9th of
perspective, I
December,
think
51
it-
days after the retreat began, around 20,000 ragged survivors of the Grande Armée began crossing the Niemen River back into friendly Polish territory. According to legend, Marshal Ney was the last man across.
Really?
Interesting to know if that's true or not. Second and third corps are no more than a memory. The latter numbers only
That's
60.
just
There's so many people that died in this war. It's just
What a
unbelievable, man. This is-
Napoleon's invasion of Russia had proved to be one of the greatest military disasters in history. He had made fatal miscalculations about geography, logistics, and above all, Russia's political and strategic response to his invasion.
He made a lot of wrong assumptions about
These
Russia.
blunders cost his empire around 500,000 men, as well as 250,000 horses and 1,000 cannon.
Oh my gosh.
Put another way, of every 12 men who marched into Russia with the Grande Armée, one was killed in action or died of wounds. 2 were taken prisoner, one of whom died in captivity. 7 died from disease or the effects of climate. Just 2 returned alive.
Yeah, I was gonna say like
One
1 or
returned
2
alive, but
made it
still
back.
two.
Whatever it's called. Oh my
Insane.
god.
That's insane.
Contrary to
Jeez.
myth, many more soldiers had died in the summer advance from heat, typhus and dysentery
I
than
had
were lost in
somebody.
the winter retreat.
Interesting.
True.
That very good to know.
Russian military casualties were
everyone,
estimated at
I always picture what Russian
150,000,
winter must have killed most.
and a huge but unknown number of civilian deaths.
Yeah.
Crazy, wow.
The Russian campaign was a catastrophe for Napoleon. Not just in lost troops and resources, but in damage to prestige and reputation. That winter, all his enemies sensed weakness and prepared to join forces against him. But the Emperor wasn't going down without a fight. Back in Paris, he admitted to his ministers, "Fortune has dazzled me, gentlemen. I've let it lead me astray. Instead of following my plan, I went to Moscow. I thought I'd make peace there. I stayed too long. I've made a grave mistake, but I'll have the means to repair it."
Really?
So, what was his plan then? He
Sorry,
implies
That
here
was
that
more than a
his
video.
plan
That was like
not
an
to go
experience
down.
that
Once
time.
again,
Epic History
shout
like
out
TV.
a-
to
was
Turn
meant to be
the
so
end to Epic History TV.
So what was his
amazing.
plan? Was his plan
He basically
to
lost.
leave
Yeah,
Russia?
That was intense. That was awesome.
Sounds like you've done that.
Okay,
That's
the next
probably
video
what
is
it
soon.
is.
I've been